Okay, welcome back. We're going to dive a little deeper into these applied principles of massage therapy, the impact that we're having on the body, and especially right now we're going to talk about connective tissue. Connective tissue is a really big piece. It's a really big component of the body, and it's something that is interweaving between all of the other organs, the skin, the muscles. There's so much going on with connective tissue. And so we need to dive extra deep to get a good comprehension on that. We have a lot of conversation happening out there in the field, and also just layman conversations, a lot of memes going on about fascia inside of the holistic health world. So let's pick apart at that whole concept a little bit. So connective tissue, what is connective tissue?
It's collagen that runs throughout the body.
It's mostly collagen, yep.
Mostly collagen that helps link your muscles to your arteries, veins,
Yeah,
organs, everything.
links it together. What kinds of connective tissue do we already know of specifically?
Interstitial fluid?
Interstitial fluid is the fluid.
It's just fluid, it's not tissue.
It's the fluid. It's the juice
The
that's
juice.
going around the tissue.
Kinds of connective tissue, like
Yes. We have some specific structural units of connective tissue.
like ligaments. And
Ligaments, exactly. Ligaments, what else?
Tendons.
Tendons, yes. And you said fascia, and we can have sheet fascia, we can have those aponeuroses. Do you remember about the aponeuroses? They're kind of sheets of fascia that are known to be in specific places, like at the sacrum and over the top of the head, where it's sort of these sheets of fascia that are webbing, kind of bridging the tensile pattern from one group of muscles to another, that are not necessarily ligaments or tendons, but are thicker than the miscellaneous myofascial tissue.
Palm of the hand, like where it's thick too, or is it in those spaces?
There's definitely a fair amount of connective tissue weaving around in the hand. One of the big ones that we specifically also focus on in the hand area is around the wrist, the retinaculum. And so that's sort of a band, like a tight bracelet, that keeps all of those tendons running from the muscles of the forearm, or flexors and extensors of the forearm that need to operate the hands and the fingers, right? But they need to be gathered together so that they come into a smaller passageway rather than being like a clunky transition across the hand. Does that make sense?
It's called the retinaculum.
Retinaculum, yeah. Retinaculum at the wrists and at the ankles. Retinaculum. Aponeurosis at the sacrum and across the skull, especially. So those are some of our big units of connective tissue that are going on in the body. But let's revisit our concept of what exactly connective tissue is doing. Connective tissue is actually the most abundant tissue in the body. And like Eva brought up, we've got collagen. So collagen is a protein that's going to function kind of like a spider web strand, right? And so any surface in the body could be an attachment point for any given piece of web that's jumping across here, right? So you might have like the capsule of the lungs attaching into the ribs, just kind of giving a little structure there. Obviously, the muscles between given ribs are going to have their little fascia bits connecting those muscle units of the intercostals. Yeah. So this is going on all around. If you could zoom in deeply down and just go hang out inside of area of ground substance of where you've got the fascial weaving across and the interstitial fluid flowing through. is the ground substance, okay? If you could go down in there, there's not a spider going around and actually creating the, signature spiderweb shape, but you would get this like cobwebby shape that's like very three-dimensional and kind of dewy, where it's all laying across each other, okay? So in the flow of the blood, we've got our red blood cells, we've got our nice big memory T cells, all this stuff going on, yeah? And we also have lots of these little platelets. They're a little bit curved, but they're basically like shreds of collagen that could land anywhere. So this is the foundation of scarring. When we have a wound open up in the tissue, let's put it on the skin so that it's a little more visually familiar. We've got the surface of the skin and maybe a cut down in there. As it starts bleeding, then our platelets are gonna rush to the site. The platelets that are in the blood are gonna activate, and they're gonna just start grabbing what they can and kind of pinning across and creating a bit of a fresh web structure and just knit that back together. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And in between these cells, ideally, if this is going to be like a really smooth healing process, the skin cells are going to actually replace these and use them as a framework to build on. So the dermis is going to keep releasing their skin cells. Skin cells are going to go up and kind of fill up this area and eventually push out the scab, and it just falls off if you get a really nice clean finish. Or if you have a really significant wound, you may have an area where the skin cells never quite all the way get back in the middle of it, and you still have the collagen network sustaining a bit of a bridge. And that's where you have like visible scarring after the fact, where the collagen has just become more dense there, and it does eventually like support cellular structure as well, but you'll have this capacity to fill in empty spaces with collagen. So what's really interesting about the behavior of collagen is like it's just kind of wandering. It can get free and go around anywhere in the body. And actually when we wake up, some of that initial stiffness of like when you feel a little short of breath and you want that first big deep breath, you open up your limbs and it feels like your elbows are a little stiff, your shoulders are a little stiff. This literally can be this collagen webbing has laid enough material overnight that you're sticking together a little bit extra, and that the position that you are holding is being reinforced by collagen webbing that's now connecting that material. If you open it back up, then that's going to pop off. Some of it's going to just go back to being free floating. Some of it will be kind of surface for other cellular metabolism stuff to happen, or it'll get cleaned up by some of our other little cells eventually. And so the more we move, the more flexible and functional our connective tissue is going to be, because it's going to get conditioned. And our sheets of fascia, where we have our big sheets of collagen, and they've really become quite interwoven over time, and they slide directionally. So there's never a time where it gets divided from the middle, but it rolls over the underlying surface and stays freely moving from what it's coasting above and below, right? And so it's kind of oiled in there, and that's our hyaluronic acid is acting like oiling the cogs in there.
Is that part of the interstitial fluid?
It's moving around, and it'll be kind of in pockets, tucked around amongst the collagen in there. Kind of, even when they take the super microscopic photography, you'll see the hyaluronic acid like dewdrops on those spiderweb threads. It's really cool, really beautiful looking. So connective tissue is highly adaptive and it's super responsive. So anytime that you injure yourself, it's going to come in and support. It's going to weave and knit up that zone. So we have different kinds of behaviors of our fascia overall. We have some fascia that's really focused on linking. And so this is going to be pretty regular and parallel distribution of that collagen. So our, let's say a ligament is strands of collagen that are really linearly distributed, interwoven to each other, and quite tidily organized. Does that make sense? It's our linking fascia. It's going between 2 points generally. And so it's just holding those points in relationship to each other. We have fascicular fascia. So that's going to be a mix of the loose and dense, multi-directional connective tissue. And these are going to be really useful for bundles. So they'll be forming kind of tubes where the structure of the tube is a little bit more this like chaotic, filled in, multi-directional fibers, but then there's a cavity up the middle of it that is protected and has that like hyaluronic lining so that the action of, say, a nerve can pass through a fascia sheet right there at that spot, or within muscles, tendons, bones, and nerves. So that's important for movement. Yeah.
Is connective tissue and fascia the same thing?
So fascia is, we're going to mostly be talking about when it's more in a sheet form or it's linking materials across. Connective tissue is a little bit our broader term for when we're talking about including the ligaments, including the tendons.
Okay. So
Yeah.
it's like
The fascia is more the sheets. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So every fascia is a connective tissue, but not every connective tissue is a fascia.
Yes. Nice. Perfect. We've got compression fascia. This is going to create order inside and be kind of parallel connective tissue layers covering the whole limbs, almost like a stocking or a sock, right? And so all of the muscles that are operating in your arm are inside of another final layer of connective tissue, the fascia that's wrapping all around that and kind of holding it tight together. And that's also going to become the foundation for the dermis. Okay? And separating fascia. So these are combination fascia, rather loose connective tissue, so more irregular laying fibers. And it's going to divide the body in visible sheets and layers of varying fibers. And so it can absorb some of that force and friction that's happening during movement and let tissues slide over each other. And so then there are sheets that ideally are not too much interconnected with each other. If you're keeping up your movement, you're going to splice out those collagen fibers that tend to build between them and keep them active so that they're sliding over each other. When we say myofascia, we're talking about the muscle fibers that are organized inside of the three-dimensional network that's surrounding and connecting the musculoskeletal system. So there are strands of actually muscle fibers.
Hi, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Rico here?
She'll be in at I think 11.
Okay. We're doing some plumbing downstairs. We're going to have to shut the water off for about 15 or 20 minutes. If anybody needs to use the bathroom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
You can be off for 15 or 20 minutes.
Everyone good?
Perfect. We're good.
Yeah, we're good. You can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
So those myofascial fibers are the muscle strands that are woven through the fascia system as well. A bit that we need to spend some time on is this idea of trigger points, okay? So trigger points are happening in the muscle system and in the myofascial system. Have you guys worked with trigger points in your hands-on?
Yes.
Oh, like spleen 6. Oh, and then she has the book that shows like how it radiates. The pain
Yeah.
can radiate at different
Yeah.
from the location.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes.
So trigger points are a little bit confusing, and technically, as of right now, although they're so well utilized, the results are so predictable, like we can't really scientifically maintain any denial of the concept of trigger points. But exactly what's happening is, again, one of those things where the mechanism is not well enough understood for us to like make big scientific claims about it. It's possible that they're like muscle spindle reset locations that are just disorganized, and so they're creating like a seized little zone within that fascia tissue. We do know that there's some electrical activity involved, that when we like read with a really fine electrometer, we can see that there's bioelectric action kind of concentrating around trigger points. And there's also generally a lot of pro-inflammatory mediators clustered around there. So like chemicals that are signatures of the body attempting to mitigate an inflammation process that's happening there. So it's several different things going on. We know there's electricity, we know there's chemistry, we know there's like mechanical force involved, but what exactly it is. Personally, I saw something really compelling that I use as my mental model when I'm working with trigger points, which was a gentleman had taken like a Eastern medicine chart of acupuncture points and laid it over a full body map of specifically places where fine nerves were perforating the fascia. And it was highly accurate. Like, it was a little eerie how well the Eastern medicine had predicted these locations where fine nerves are having to perforate or like cross through the fascia. So they need to still be mobile and able to like adaptively dive in and out of really small channels in the connective tissue webbing. I found that super interesting.
So without tools specific to that, like technology to, which I don't even know what that would be. Like, how do you detect electromagnetic? Is it like a little beep, beep, beep?
Well, you don't have to.
Well, I know.
Right, like we've seen it, yeah, exactly, with
conceptualize it.
just like a monitor that's picking up electrical signaling and like letting us map
So
it.
without that technology, they were
Mhm.
still able to find
Mhm.
those locations.
Right.
Acupuncture is many thousands of years old. We don't even know
Right.
the origin of
We
it.
don't really have a good grip on.
The aliens
Yeah.
came to the planet. And said,
Right.
"This is how we
Back
do
when
it."
the aliens helped us out by scanning our whole bodies and giving us maps and then being
It's
like,
the,
you're on your own.
That's like the oral tradition song, the Hawaiian like recounting of history, and it starts with describing friction caused heat, which caused life. So they're kind of describing the Big Bang. It's like thousands of years old.
How did you know?
How'd you
Well,
do
we
that?
Right.
How'd you
Right.
do that?
It just feels right sometimes, you know? Like, it's just, we can sense it.
Yeah.
But anyway, to be a little bit back onto the literal aspect of what's going on with trigger points, we do also know that they're highly concentrated in weak or overloaded muscles. So especially both weak and overloaded muscles. If they're a little bit underperforming, like underbuilt muscular structures that then have an inappropriate amount of load put on them abruptly, that's when we see a trigger point arising generally. And they're much more involved in myofascial pain syndrome than other muscles when they have that combo of phenomenon. So we'll expect to see that set of mechanisms going on in a place where a trigger point is really accessible to us. So when we're looking at problems in structure and structural pain and wondering if they might be affected by potential trigger point issues, We'll especially dial in on the idea of connective tissue dysfunction with pain disorders that have lasted more than 12 weeks, and especially if there's inflammation present that's kind of nonsensical, like the inflammation already did what it could possibly do, but it's persisting and just failing to be triggered into cleanup mode to finalize that area. So with overuse, connective tissue is actually going to progressively stabilize and become more fibrous. And so I want you to picture like a sweater, and so the sweater is going to be the fibers of the connective tissue, all these like coiling collagen bits that are weaving across in a network, right? If you snag on something, kind of cut an area of the sweater, if you're quick about it, you might be able to put a patch on it, use another piece of material to bind that together, and if you can get it in tight enough, you'll be able to patch it up, right? But after that, when you pull on the sweater, the effect of the stretchiness that the like knit material originally had is going to have a flaw. You're going to not have the same stretchiness effect going across that patch, right? When connective tissue is damaged, it will self-patch. We'll have these collagen networks just smack in there, lay over the top of it, and bind up with these platelets. But they will not be organized the same way that the original tissue was, and they'll tend to be a bit more dense. If you are progressively damaging or overstraining an area of connective tissue, it's going to continue to lay these platelets, and they may be fully organized. They're going to more or less fit in with the action pattern of the material around them, but it will ultimately thicken that material. And so if you take like a ligament of the knee that's continually being re-injured, you may have places where it tore and there's actual tears, and so that scar network is more chaotic. But you could also have micro tears where the scarring is progressively creating more bulk in the tissue of the ligament itself.
Is that also what bodybuilders are doing with their muscles when they work out? Is they're building up bulk by kind of injuring the muscle by straining it?
Right. It's a little bit different mechanism between the connective tissue versus the muscle, but yeah, exactly. Building muscle essentially requires micro tearing, where we're putting enough damage into the cell that it has to do active repair work, and that's where we're going to generate more tissue in the muscle fiber. Yeah.
But you don't want to be doing that to our ligaments.
Yeah, generally we want to protect our ligaments as much as possible, although it's adaptive for a reason. So like if you're a person that for whatever reason, like a big part of your life is like jumping off of relatively higher surfaces, you will build up that adaptation to the level that you use it. If you suddenly jump off a much higher surface, you're going to overstrain that ligament and create a new tear system. But if you're like always jumping off of, say, 5 feet, like your knees, your ankles, your hips will all have already adapted to the anticipated amount of strain on those ligaments and tendons. Yeah.
Parkour.
Yeah, parkour. Of course, if they're overloaded, then they can fail in joint stabilization. When ligaments or tendons have failed in stabilizing a joint, that's when you're going to see hypermobilization, where it's possible for the bones to move in relation to each other in a way that's dysfunctional, probably causing more damage on more connective tissue, possibly more muscles, and is not giving you the proper leverage that joint is made for also, right? And so when we have somebody on the table and we're bringing body work into a structural question or a pain issue there, it will be really tempting to reach for our stretching tools. But on a joint that is hypermobilized, stretching is not helpful. We don't want to train those ligaments and connective tissue to continue allowing beyond the natural range of motion we want to bring it back into relationship and allow the constriction that's more ergonomic and structural to resume after damaged tissue. So this is part of why people might have their arm in a sling after an arm injury. Like, we're literally holding the bones into a position where that connective tissue can knit back across. And then eventually you have to do the rebuilding process of restoring the muscle tissue, adjusting the muscle fibers, and also opening back up the little bit erroneously placed collagen fibers that are weaving across where you don't need support. And so you're going to pop those back open as you resume normal body function.
Not stretching, but range of motion exercises that gradually, and massage that will gradually increase the range of motion.
Yeah, gently, right, exactly. And range of motion might not always be the goal to increase it, but simply establishing it. Maybe you have an elbow that the person could just drop it out like way too much, but you don't want to drop it out. You want to give them opportunities to move through their appropriate range of motion. And it doesn't really matter if you build that range of motion up or not. It's just allowing it to go through that motion such that it doesn't have so much recovery to do at the end could be helpful at times. But also strengthening the muscles that are in support of that joint is really important. So when massage therapy has not had a great outcome for somebody and afterward they're like, no, I hurt worse after seeing this massage therapist, almost every time we find that the therapist really leaned into like, oh, we could increase the range of motion, we could open this up, and actually further destabilize the joint while having nothing to offer the strengthening process of the joint.
So really the massage therapist should have suggested more exercise or see a physical therapist.
If they're already on that course, then like encouraging them to stick with that is great. If you want to refer them to a physical therapist, you always can suggest that that might be helpful and that strength could be a part of the concern. But also balancing and just bringing back symmetry, allowing the person to cognitively experience the difference between the damaged tissue and equivalent non-damaged tissue to help them kind of neurologically calibrate and remember what movement it should feel like. Opening up any other places where they're compensating, where maybe the elbow is funky and so they're doing some weird stuff with their shoulder to get around the pain in the elbow. So extra nurturing on that shoulder and into the neck could be really helpful there. But you don't need to like floss the elbow further. Okay. So fascia inherently is wavy, it's relaxed, and it's slippery, but it does have a little bit of a stickiness, especially when the distribution of hyaluronan is kind of like not well distributed, when it's uneven. And it'll tend toward densification. Of course, when it gets dense, just like that patch in the sweater, it's going to lose pliability and it's not going to stretch in the same dimension that the rest of the tissue around it is stretching. Okay.
Can you say more time what retinaculum is?
Huh?
Can you say more time what retinaculum is? Like,
Yeah,
is it the space
retinaculum. The retinaculum is the fascia, the connective tissue band that's wrapping around the outside of all the tendons that are running up and down the arm and into the hand. And so it's kind of gathering it. It's like the ribbon on a bouquet.
And would that be something that felt, well, so the nerves in carpal tunnel syndrome would be the thing that's like sending the pain response, but would the fascia like respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. If the retinaculum itself is bound down onto the substructure and grabbing those nerves, it can absolutely be contributing to that. If it's tightening in such a way that the carpals are collapsing and so the actual tunnel of the carpal tunnel is not giving quite enough space for the nerves to pass through, then like a lot of connective tissue features can be going on there. And I'm sure that you've already been experiencing, like when you put your hands on somebody and there's muscle tightness and you're like, and the muscles start lengthening out. But there's also the sensation that you can pick up where it's not really the muscles, where you are reading the connective tissue structure, and that when you first touch it, it's kind of locked into place more so, but that as you give it some linear friction, as you give it some stretching, it just becomes more pliable, and like the skin might move more easily over the deeper tissues, etc. What are we doing? Okay, we look good. Awesome. One thing to be aware of with the way that the fascia operates is, now we're gonna jump to a totally different metaphor, and I want you to think about like thick jello or like gelatin, agar-agar kind of structure, yeah? Where there's a bit of a bounce to it, and if you think about like having a whole tray of like kind of heavier set gelatin, you know, like when you pour it in just the hot water, you don't thin it out, you know what I'm talking about? A little more resistance. We're gonna call that the thixotropy of the ground substance. And so thixotropy is the tendency to coalesce or to like become more gel-like. So the ground substance, the interstitial fluid, and the fibers of that connective tissue are going to have a more gel-like relationship when we get cold, when we get stiff, sometimes just out of under stress. But when it collates like that, then that liquid medium is going to act more like our like really thick jello. So if you think about like dropping a butter knife onto the jello, you're going to get an actual bounce off of the material, right? If you take the butter knife and you just like sweep into it, you could still get some bounce back and more like tearing, right? But if you are easing really slowly in firm, steady pressure, then it's going to progressively give on a like molecule by molecule basis to the pressure until you're actually cutting it, and then you can draw your quirky jello shapes in your pan of jello, right? And the tissue of our own ground substance is also going to behave like that, and you'll pick that up more and more in your fingers, where boinging into somebody's tissue is going to have some effect, but it's not really going to change the tissue. The tissue is going to be resistant to that. It's going to be more of a neurological effect if you're trying to adjust something with like a tapping effect or whatever, right? And if you're going really fast across something and you're getting that friction, you're getting that maybe exfoliation could be a goal there for that. But if you're wanting to change the structure of what's happening down in the ground substance, you want to adjust the delineation of the fascia or the way that the fascia is grabbing and clinging between muscle structures or whatever, your slow, steady movement is really going to be what gets you there. And so going super slow and easy, that's something that I always like to remind students, especially when we're trying to like memorize a sequence and we're doing the recall and like, you know, like shoo, 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 right? But a huge part of the art form is going to come when you start actually sensing into the way that the ground substance, the way that the connective tissue is responding to you, and you'll find that it really likes slow. And as you ease into a slower and slower form of practice, then you'll be able to draw the nervous system in, draw all of these mechanical and fluid effects, and get it like collaborated and create that really like deep experience where the tissue is able to yield to you on a really deep level. I think that is enough of our content for today. Let's close it out with a few moments of settling back in, focusing back in to the body. And while you are working on your hands-on today, I would love if you just tuned in extra to the sensations of the connective tissue and became really aware of those sensations. the way that the web can be really transferring tension from one area of the body to completely other areas of the body, and our whole frame can be getting slightly yanked and twisted so variously. But for right now, let's visit into our energy. Drop through the layers. Let's come into ourselves through the skin, through the connective tissue, through the muscles, through the blood vessels, through that lymphatic material, slowly, steadily sweeping back up towards the heart. Drop into the nervous system, those electrical signals. And then through the bones. Hold each bone. With your breath. Really allow that breath to engage deep into the diaphragm. Ease off any contraction patterns in the neck. Letting the shoulders drop with each breath in and each breath out. Now I want you to practice for a moment the sensation of shielding, of sensing your own bubble of energy that's around your body, the leftover magnetic electric field of all of your metabolic functions and signatures of your cells, kind of verving into space right around you. And hold that sensation of feeding all of that back into yourself. And being able to close yourself off inside of that bubble like a force field. Feel the sense of safety, of enclosing yourself with your own energy. Feel that sense of safety with gratitude. And with love, flowing of that elevation of your emotions. And release that, return to the skin, return to the sensations of the room, return to the light. All right. From here on out, we have a fair amount of flexibility to really revisit any questions or concepts that might need some shoring up for you guys, and deal with some test prep concepts a little more deeply as well. So if you're able to take some time sort of assessing where you would like to go, how you would like to spend the rest of our sessions together, I will plan to be ready for anything. And we'll follow it around, figure out where we're meant to go. All right.
Those quiz questions were really great.
We can definitely spend more time on that. That's what I figure. Structure around that, and then if anybody has more theoretical ideas we need to revisit, we can always do that. Cool. See you next week.
See you next week.